Hi, Dr. Dave Webster. Welcome back to my website. This is on the case scenarios page, as you know. I'd just like to run a couple of quick cases by you to demonstrate the travesty of, being sick in Ontario, particularly with cancer, and why I finally reached the point where I can no longer look into patients' eyes and say, I'm so sorry, if only you hadn't lived in Ontario. These two particular cases happen to be about colon cancer. The first case is a gentleman who presented with colon cancer. When he was being operated, he'd been worked up and was decided he was operable. So the surgeon during the operation could feel up into the abdomen and could feel that there were a couple of masses in the liver. The patient went on then to have an MR and a CT. They couldn't get any tissue, which would have been the ideal situation, but that just wasn't possible. The results of the MR and CT concluded that this was most likely just a benign growth in the liver, something called an hemangioma, which shouldn't be of any concern to the patient. The surgery was in the December of a particular year. Those two tests were done in January. So it turns out that the patient, as is routine, had a follow-up CT in June, and guess what? These masses are getting larger, and of course, therefore, they're not hemangiomas. They are, in fact, cancers. So the patient actually didn't want to wait, and so went to the States, got their surgery. Bottom line is they come back the following December again. Now it's a year later, and they get their follow-up CT. And the radiologist who read it basically wrote the report simply said there's been progression of the disease. This family was absolutely devastated, and so they, in fact, this gentleman owned a large business and was prepared to sell that business because he didn't want his wife burdened with the debt. Turns out that he'd heard about PET scanning, had a friend who was a physician, and interestingly, this patient actually had to argue with his oncologist to get this test. This is the extraordinary situation in Ontario. For some reason, Ontario oncologists are unique in the world. They not only do not support PET generally, in many cases they absolutely badmouth it. For some reason, they seem to be believing the government on this one. I don't know whether they're not going to the meetings or what, because if you go to the international meetings, it's quite an embarrassment, quite frankly, when I go there, because they simply scratch their heads and say, Dave, what's wrong with your oncologists? Anyway, the bottom line is the patient did get a PET scan. And here is actually an image of that PET scan. And what you can see, in fact, there's just one little spot there on the liver that turns out to be a problem. The reality is that look at these other images here. All of these little bites out of this liver, or I'm going to say cold defects, are in fact where the CT was abnormal, but the lack of FDG uptake shows that these are almost certainly just areas of scar tissue rather than actively cancer. The surgeon who had operated on him agreed, and so this man went from being told your life is over, get your affairs in order, sell your business, whatever, to now being told, look, go off to Florida, have a nice time with the wife, when you come back in April, we'll take that out. That little small one, he chose to have a different approach to that. He went to the States and had more work done on that. But the bottom line you need to understand is that if that patient had had a PET scan, at the original workup on his diagnosis, when it was found out that he had, liver findings, that the PET scan would have shown at that time that virtually certainly these were metastases, and he could have had, appropriate treatment, which happened to be, in this case, it was possible to have surgical resection of these sites, and he could have had that, in January, we'll say, of that year, rather than waiting till eventually August of the following year. As you can imagine, that in that period of time, the cancer had lots of time to grow and ultimately spread, and he eventually did die of his disease. Who knows what would have happened if he had have been able to get that PET scan sooner. By the way, he had to pay for that PET scan because, of course, he lived in Ontario, and you couldn't get access to that. You also need to understand that some 50% of patients in this province who have colon cancer, recurrent colon cancer, actually can't qualify for a routine PET scan. The government finally is in their gracious wisdom have decided to allow a few colon cancer patients to get scans, but still about 50% of colon cancer patients cannot get access to these things. There was a paper published a number of years ago that said if you had appropriate PET scanning as part of the routine management or follow-up of your colon cancer, that you improved your chances of survival at 3 years by, it was over 60%. But again, this is evidence-based medicine, Ontario, isn't it? The second case is again another tragic case. This is a gentleman who is in his late 40s. He has colon cancer, and again, his workup has suggested that he is riddled with disease, to the point, not riddled, but he certainly has enough disease that there really is no point in operating, that he really, again, should just get his affairs in order. Yet again, this gentleman had to argue with his oncologist to get a PET scan. He actually was inspired by the man I spoke just about a minute ago. Actually went on national TV eventually and was, talked about his story. This other gentleman, also from Sudbury, had seen this story, and then he eventually went to the news media as well. But the bottom line is that he eventually did get a PET scan. Again, he had to pay for it. This is Ontario. Remember, if he'd have been living in Argentina or Chile at the time, they would have said, you would have benefited potentially from a PET scan. He had it, and the reality is that what the PET scan showed, that the CT findings were not cancer, almost certainly that what he did have was a single operable lesion. So this man went on to get finally surgery for that single operable lesion and was disease-free for, I don't know, 4 or 5 years. Unfortunately, tragically, that has come back. But the point is that this man had been handled up front correctly, then it's possible the outcome might have been different. Whether or not he had any other, whether he not would have benefited from other PET scans and so on. Is not clear. I don't know the case details, but the reality is, remember the paper I just mentioned, that it improves your survival. Remember that one of the reasons Quebec has PET scanning, and now we're pleased to have it, but they were sued by Mr. Barry Stein, a colon cancer survivor who had also stage 4 cancer. I don't know, it's probably more than 10 or 12 years ago now, and the man is still alive. He's been followed up appropriately and so on. So that the point again I'm trying to drive home is that this is Ontario. This is the epicenter of the universe when it comes to evidence-based medicine, and this is the kind of decisions they're making. This is why I simply am fed up. I have to with this website, because I just cannot look these patients any longer in the face, and knowing what the government is doing, knowing what has been said about the evidence-based medicine approach that they've taken, as I mentioned elsewhere in the videos, but basically unethical, scientifically baseless, and even immoral, claims of a moral process by the senior member of the PET Steering Committee. So again, explore the website, but more importantly, don't just explore it. Get out there and become active. Do whatever you can to use the power of the internet and social networking to challenge the government. Because as I've tried to make clear before, remember, this isn't just about PET. This is about your health care. This is only one particularly good example. See my website on the government removing the technical fee on OHIP for diagnostic tests. The government has been so successful at blocking you from PET. They're now moving into looking at restricting access to all diagnostic imaging tests. So please take advantage of the website. Forget the media; they're not interested. Let's go after them together. Let the government and their various expert advisory committees that have taken us to this travesty of a position. Thanks.